Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. You'll also find our archives, where you can listen to every episode we've ever done going back to 2006. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is October 4th, 2012, and my guest is Jonathan Rodden, a professor of political science at Stanford University and a senior fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution. Jonathan, welcome to EconTalk.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
We're going to talk about your research on voting and geography, and if we have time, we'll explore some other issues that you've been working on as well. But I want to start by talking about the book you're working on, which has at least the tentative title, The Long Shadow of the Industrial Revolution, Geography and the Representation of the Left. Let's start with what seems to be true in the United States geographically. People in cities seem to vote differently from people in the suburbs and rural areas with a lot of consistency. What do we know about this pattern in the United States and outside the United States?
Yeah, it's something that I think anyone who looks at an electoral map in the United States can easily identify. I mean, we've been mainly looking at county level maps over the last few elections, and it's hard not to see that kind of pattern. When you look at a state like Missouri, for instance, you'll see that St. Louis County and the counties around Kansas City are blue, and the rest of the state looks kind of some shade of red or purple.
Where blue means supporting Democrats and red means voting for Republicans.
Unfortunately, those are the colors that American cartographers have picked up. In the rest of the world, red, of course, means left. We have to do things a little bit differently. It makes it hard for me when I make the maps to try to explain the argument in the book and elsewhere. But yes, Americans are always referring to the Democrats as blue for some reason. But this is something that shows up in those county level maps. But what we didn't see that is something I've found interesting is I've been investing a lot of time and effort into collecting precinct level data and then trying to make some precinct level maps, and I've been doing this for a variety of other countries as well, is that this kind of correlation between population density and voting behavior seems to hold even at much lower levels of analysis, so that if we go within some county, even in rural Missouri, and we go from the very sparsely populated periphery of that county, and then we move into the county seat, a place that has a little bit of rental housing, maybe clustered along some railroad tracks. We see that correlation between population density and voting behavior. It shows up even at that very small, even at that very kind of fine-grained scale. And that's something I found really interesting and started looking around to see where is that true kind of more generally. And it's true in lots of places. I'm discovering it's not completely universal. There are conservative cities. And some of them have a kind of a long history. So Stockholm is an example of a place where there's a clustering of conservatives in the city center, and there has been for some time. There is well-known neighborhoods in Madrid that are kind of everyone can point to that is they're densely populated and are conservative. In the United States, it's really quite striking. I think maybe the only example of a place that is very densely populated that votes consistently for Republicans is Little Havana in Miami. But kind of
the exception that proves the rule.
Exactly. So that correlation is especially strong in the U.S. And what I've found is that it's very strong in the other countries that use these winner-take-all majoritarian institutions, which really I'm referring to places colonized by Great Britain and Britain itself. And so we see that correlation between density and voting in Britain and in New Zealand before, especially before they changed their electoral institutions. In Canada, it's very striking as well. So I've made some precinct level maps of Canada where you look at the Great Lakes states in the U.S. and you look at the kind of southern Ontario and that part of Canada, and the electoral maps look identical. You can't even tell where one country stops and the other one begins. You have that clustering of left votes in the cities. So it's a very common pattern, and one of the things I'm still trying to fully understand is under what conditions does that pattern come through the strong? Is it most clear? And this is where I've the book ultimately doesn't really have anything in the title about urbanization or cities. It says something about industrialization, and I think that is really the story. That when I mentioned that Stockholm has these dense conservative neighborhoods, I think that has something to do with the fact that the process of industrialization was different in Sweden than it was in the United States.
Now, Jonathan, before you get to that, just explain for a minute, when you use the phrase winner take all, you're referring to the fact that once you get more votes than the other person, you get the seat. Doesn't matter whether you win 90% or 50.1, or if there's multiple candidates, if you win by one vote, right?
Right, and this is this is the way elections were conducted in most of the world up until a period around World War I. You divide up a country into districts, and there are candidates running in those districts, and the person with the most votes wins. And it could be a 4 or 5 party split, and someone could win with 30% of the vote. And in fact, that happened quite frequently in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So most European countries had these a system much like the United States with winner-take-all districts. But then there was a big transformation around between the turn of the century and at the tail end of World War I, where a lot of continental European countries switched to a system of proportional representation, where the number of seats you received in the legislature is proportionate to the number of votes received by a party, which has the effect of inviting, creating more political parties. So when I teach a course on political institutions, one of the first things we think about in the United States is if the U.S. had proportional representation, what kind of a party system would we have? And most students kind of, when they think about it, believe there'd be a libertarian party that would be more successful, and that perhaps there would be a party that was more focused on African Americans. Those are at least a couple of the possibilities.
Green
Party. We'd have finer grain distinctions on the two. Yeah, Green Party, and maybe a party that is economically liberal but socially conservative, and vice versa. And that's the kind of thing that seems to emerge. So these electoral rules can have a really important impact on who gets represented and what politics looks like in a country. And what I'm doing in this project is thinking about that from a perspective that's a little different than the way we usually think about it. I'm linking it to geography, and I think that's part of the reason why some of these countries look very different. Is when you combine the geography of preferences with these electoral rules, you get some really different kinds of results.
And which countries have proportional representation right now? What are some countries that do it that way rather than districts with winner-take-all one seat per district or number of seats per district?
So most of continental Europe uses some type of proportional representation, and so maybe the country that people tend to think of as the purest form of proportional representation is the Netherlands, where there's a very high proportionality between the percentage of the votes and the seats, and there's really just one single national district. The country isn't even divided up into various electoral districts. The same is true of Israel. So these are often kind of thought of as the purest forms of proportional representation. But there are also proportional electoral systems in most of continental Europe. It's been one country after another made that switch to the point where it's really the wealthy, developed countries that still use single-member districts are limited to France and the former British colonies that I mentioned earlier, including the United States.
What about the United Kingdom?
So the UK still uses it's kind of still the classic case of a winner-take-all majoritarian system. And it's one that is still many of the other countries that were colonized by Great Britain also use these institutions. So once we move beyond the wealthy countries, India uses a single-member district winner-take-all system, very much like Great Britain, and a lot of the islands in the Caribbean that were colonized by England, and several African countries.
Now, a lot of people have looked at Israel and speculated whether it's relative instability of party leaders and prime ministers is a result of its fractious party system, where there's lots and lots of parties along the lines that you opened and talked about. Do other countries have that? Is there any? I mean, the United States obviously, we only have two strong major parties. That has benefits, but lots of negatives. The result of that is that the president usually stays in power for 4 years, unless, God forbid, there's a catastrophe, an accident, or crime. It's very rare. The House can turn over every 2 years, but often stays in the hands of one party for a relatively long period of time. And so people claim that the United States is, because of that, because of the Constitution, tends to be a little bit inertial, doesn't have a lot of ability to change dynamically and quickly, whereas these other systems change more quickly, but they're less, quote, stable, which obviously there are costs and benefits of either system. But is that true about proportional representation? Is it less stable? Is it more, quote, fractious, whatever that means?
Well, I think the problem with that claim is that proportional representation it contains such a wide variety of different types of systems, and so Israel might be kind of at one extreme. There are ways of making a proportional representation system a little bit less chaotic. So a kind of an earlier example of exactly that complaint, some people blamed the rise of the Nazis and the breakup of Weimar Germany to an excessively proportional electoral system that created lots of parties and lots of chaos, and constantly coalitions falling and new ones forming and elections being called. And so in the German post-war constitution, they created a system that is far less fractious, and they have the thing called the constructive vote of no confidence, so that you can't take apart a government unless you have another one prepared, already in place. They also have a 5% hurdle so that you have to have 5% of the vote to get representation in parliament. So lots of proportional countries have institutions like these that make them a lot more stable. And it's also the case that voters in many Scandinavian countries, for instance, have a pretty clear sense of which parties will coalesce. And so they go to the polls almost thinking, even though there are 5, 6, 7 parties in some cases, there are often two big blocks of parties, and it's pretty clear which parties will work together. And so it doesn't always create as much chaos and kind of blackmail potential for the small parties as one might expect. But certainly there are some countries when that happens, and the proportional system in Italy in the past has been blamed for some of its difficulties, and Belgium as well in the past has been a case where there's been a lot of fiscal indiscipline that people have blamed on multi-party coalitions.
Well, it gives minority parties more power than they might otherwise have, not just in terms of number of seats, but in the ability to be part, or as you say, blackmail or veto a coalition creation. That's something that as Americans we don't have that experience via that mechanism. There are within each party and sometimes in the legislature minority viewpoints that can be decisive in similar ways, but it's not the same structure.
Yes, all that diversity gets reflected within the two major parties in the United States, and a lot of the negotiations take place in a kind of a different way, whereas they might take place between parties in a proportional system. Right. They take place, between say the Tea Party caucus and the rest of the Republicans, or the Congressional Black Caucus and the rest of the Democrats.
But going back to this point about density, so we just had a little digression on forms of government. Let's go back to your point about geographical density and the implications for political views. So there's this strong correlation between population density and political preferences of the voting population. When did that start? When was that? When could you first point to that as an empirical regularity? How old is it?
I think that the answer is a little different in Europe than it is in North America. It seemed to correspond to the Industrial Revolution in Europe, that once people, peasants, left farms and moved to cities and started working as wage laborers in factories, they became targets for the mobilization efforts of socialists and social democrats and workers' parties. And it was, the very fact of this density and the creation of labor unions is what generated the kind of left-right politics that we know in many developed countries. And it became, urbanization became almost a prerequisite for the generation degeneration of the left as we know it. In the United States, it happened a little bit later. The Democrats didn't really clearly become the party of urban workers until around the New Deal. And so one of the things, some graphs that I've made that haven't quite made it into the manuscript yet, but if you look at the correlation between the county level correlation between population density and voting, you just see a lot of nothing up until the 1920s. And then toward the end of the 20s and into the 30s, all of a sudden this relationship emerges. And it just gets stronger and stronger over time. And that's one of the things that I've puzzled over is that, it seems to have a lot to do with the location of factories and railroads and shipping routes and things like this, warehouses. But the relationship has become even stronger even in the last 15 or 20 years. So there seems to be something even more to this relationship in the United States than the mere fact that we have 19th century housing and sort of dense working class housing in the city centers. There seems to be a bit more to it, and maybe it has something to do, because some of the neighborhoods that are voting for the left that are very dense are not proletarian kind of places at all. They're downtown San Francisco and the Upper East Side in Manhattan, downtown Seattle, places like this that are very high income.
Not a lot of folks working on the assembly line. So that's one of the kind of
striking.
You don't have a lot of folks working on the assembly line there.
Exactly. And this is something kind of fascinating that's happened in a lot of cities. It's not just the United States. There is this moment at which the working class housing of the early 20th century empties out. There are no longer workers there, and sort of a very new type of person moves in who is mainly interested in buying, being able to walk out the door and get a certain type of latte or a certain style of sushi.
Yeah.
And that's, what the city brings them. It's not proximity to a place where they're sharing tools with a bunch of other workers. It's something about consumption opportunities. And so from Sydney to London to San Francisco and New York, the vote share of the left remains remarkably consistent as the working class moves out and this new class of urban, for lack of a better word, yuppie, moves in. The left, the Labour vote share in Australia or England stays the same. It stays at 85% or something.
And as you
point
out,
I still haven't completely understood.
But as you point out, and this is one of the most striking correlations. It's hard to imagine that it's causal, but you make an interesting case. One of the striking correlations you point out is that voting patterns in U.S. presidential elections don't mirror the location of manufacturing. Tell me if I got this right. Do not mirror the location of current manufacturing jobs, but do mirror the location of manufacturing jobs decades ago.
Exactly. This is one of the things that really hits you over the head. If you go into the current 2000 or the 2010 census and you get some data on manufacturing employment as a share of total employment, and you plot that against the Obama vote share or the Kerry vote share or something like that, there's no relationship at all. But if you go back in the 1880 census or the 1910 census and you do the same thing, manufacturing as a share of total employment, you see this striking positive relationship between historical manufacturing employment and current Democratic vote share, and so my argument for that is that these places that are voting, 85-90% for the Democrats, tend to be places like downtown Cleveland, where there's no manufacturing to speak of anymore, but all of the housing that was built for the workers in that early part of the century is still there. And so all these places that industrialized before the rise of the automobile have these dense kind of proletarian neighborhoods with a lot of affordable, dense apartments. These places kind of attract the type of person who tends to vote for the left, and that happens in lots of different countries. That's kind of, I think, the thing that links all this together in these various countries.
Now, you just said...
And this is where that density correlation comes from.
You just said that in a particular way. You said it attracts people who tend to vote for parties on the left. And I think when the average person, well, let's not say the average person, as an economist, when I think about this phenomenon, which fascinates me, why are cities so, it's not, as you point out, it's not 55-45 Democrat, Republican. It's 85-12. It's 97, 90 to 7. Your natural thought as an economist is there's sort of two natural ways to think about it. One is the way you just described it, that people who are attracted to these types of living arrangements of high density happen to be people of the left. The other alternative way to think about it is that when you live in close proximity to other people, you have a taste for larger government, say, or you're going to want more government services. You're going to rely more on government. Another argument would be in a dense urban area, people are a little bit scary. Strangers are more prevalent. You don't have the ties that you'd have in a rural environment with your neighbors because you're not building a barn together. And so you've got to have something to substitute for community. And these sort of these are kind of cheesy, back of the hand, I don't know what you want to call them, armchair explanations. Have people written about this? I assume they have in political science. So is there any?
Yeah, there's kind of less there than you would think. But these arguments they're all kind of there in one form or another. To me, it all kind of boils down to the different stories you're telling right now. Is it a selection effect or a treatment effect?
Correct.
So do cities actually, if we could randomly assign individuals to suburban, rural, or urban environments, would we see that the city actually changes your preferences? Because you understand something about the value of public transportation for an urban resident, or you're tripping over drug addicts on the way to work, and you want something done about that, or is it the case that people with leftist preferences are more comfortable in cities and they choose to move to cities? Exactly. I'm the kind of person that has especially high income people who have the choice. I mean, and so that's another further refinement. There are people who have the choice of whether or not to live in cities. There's also, though, still a lot about the housing. I think the combination of housing availability and actually, there's some good work by Ed Glazer suggesting that one of the reasons why the poor cluster in cities in the United States is because of the transportation infrastructure and the lack of automobile ownership among the poor. So that combination of this 19th century housing with bus and train network makes it so that we just have a big. It could be income that's doing most of the work in the story. And I think that is still probably the case, that the stories I'm telling about the Upper East Side and maybe the Gold Coast of Chicago and San Francisco, those are a little bit unique. For the most part, we're talking about people at the bottom of the economic spectrum. There's clustering of poor people in cities that has various explanations.
When we talk about density, we're talking right now, most of the time we've been talking about urban density, that is at the extreme, one end of the extreme, very dense. How does it vary? How does left-right vary with suburbs and then rural?
So if you think about a graph that on the x-axis, the horizontal axis is just the origin is the center of some U.S. city, and as you travel along the horizontal axis, you're getting more and more miles from the city center. The Republican vote share is pretty much a increasing function of that distance. So as you move out into the early kind of developed suburbs of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, you end up with places that are modestly Democratic. And then you get into the middle suburbs and you find these really purple places. And then you get out to the exurbs and it's pretty Republican. And then you get to the rural areas and it's very Republican. But it's still never, the rural areas the precincts are never as Republican as the urban precincts are Democratic. So you don't really find 85, 90% Republican precincts, really almost anywhere. Yeah. Which is just sort of an interesting fact. I'm not quite sure what explains it.
No, it's fascinating. So let's get back to this role of industrialization. What does that have to do with it? Is it just this strange housing stock that's left over from the fact that workers had to once live very close to where they worked? They didn't have cars to commute. There was a big factory that hired a lot of people, so a lot of people lived near it, and so they were going to be densely housed. And whether it's treatment or selection, it's that housing stock today that's still affecting political outcomes. Is that your story?
Yeah, that's my best explanation for what we see, because the housing stock is so resilient. Once you put the bricks and mortar into place, they don't go away. Housing doesn't really disappear. I mean, we have our efforts at urban renewal that we occasionally go after. Europe was much of Europe was bombed in World War II, but the striking thing about that is that they often built on the same footprint of the bombed-out building. They built a pretty similar style of building, similar height, similar kind of number of units, and for a similar type of worker. And so you didn't really see the change in, say, German residential neighborhoods after World War II that you might have guessed. So my point is that there's something about the built environment that once a city gets built up, its basic structure, while there's plenty of suburbanization that takes place, but that urban core, generally, something about it is very resilient, and it kind of makes these patterns last a really long time. So, and it's not even just the cities. Yeah, go ahead.
So when Europe moved away from winner take all to a proportional representation system, you tell a story in the book about the role that, as you said earlier, the factories start up because of industrialization. Workers become unionized. They're more sympathetic to socialism. The far left party emerges, a socialist party. And of course, that's a threat to existing parties on the left and to some extent to parties on the right. How did that urbanization and industrialization affect the evolution of political systems in Europe, and why didn't it happen here in the United States?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, kind of more broadly, I'm interested in trying to understand why does Britain still have a single member district system? Why did it not also switch to proportional representation? Because it came very close. We've never really had a moment in the U.S. where we were kind of on the verge of choosing proportional representation nationally, but they did have a moment like that in the U.K. And in fact, they have made the transition in the 1990s in New Zealand. But so the issue is, as I try to understand it, the way I think these proportional representation systems ended up coming into being is that there were actors. There were people who had safe seats in cities. Often it was in Europe, it was liberals versus conservatives were the main parties in the early part of the century. And as the working class gained the franchise and was able to vote, these leftist parties started to win in the cities. And so what that was doing is it was squeezing out the existing parties who saw that they could only win 30% of the vote, whereas they used to be able to win, say, 60% in some district. And so they still had a sizable share of the vote, but it was spread out around the population, so across the districts. And so it became obvious to these parties that they were going to be squeezed out of existence if they didn't make a change in the electoral system before it was too late. And so those pre-existing parties often tried to make a deal. The various parties that were about to get squeezed out kind of made a deal that led to the adoption of proportional representation. But that deal just never, there was never really a far left party in the U.S. that started to squeeze out, the socialists and the progressives. The socialist kind of the platform was adopted, sort of taken over by the Democrats in the 1930s. And so there wasn't really this moment when an insurgent party was going to push the Democrats out of existence. And perhaps at that moment, the Democrats, if they were smart, would have pushed for PR, but that never happened. And in Great Britain, the liberals were the party of the left before the Labour Party came around. And the Labour Party started to quickly gain support. And the liberals, had they seen where things were going, they would have insisted on proportional representation. In fact, they eventually tried, and to this day, the Liberals are still pushing for proportional representation in the UK. But they didn't see that they would be squeezed out, and that the Labour Party would become the main party of the left. And so they kind of missed their opportunity, and they've been ruining that ever since. And they've been squeezed into kind of a marginal third party status. But that's, it's another version of that classic question about the United States. Why did the United States not develop a strong socialist party that squeezed out, the sort of center-left party? And it's probably something that lies a little bit beyond the story that I'm telling about geography. There's probably a lot more to it.
So the story that you're telling, let's see if I understand the intuition of it. The intuition is that if I used to get 55% of the vote in my district, and now I get 45 or 30, I get nothing because I never win. I have to win.
Right.
I have to. So the proportional representation lets some of my team stay in power. It reminds me of the way you hear some people think about redistricting in the United States. So you take a guy who's got, say, a 60% vote share, 70% vote share, and you know he's of the other party, and you know you're never going to win. So you give him a piece of somebody else's district that makes him win by 90, but that doesn't cost you anything because he still only wins his one seat. You take the other people in a different district, and you get your share up above 50, and it's it's somewhat similar in terms of the intuition.
Yeah, and that that's what the intuition is kind of similar. That there's an underlying distribution of political preferences in space, but then when you map onto that some district boundaries and you make them winner take all, and then you have a legislature that is made of those representatives, you can end up with a very different distribution in that legislature than you saw in the society, and it matters a lot how you draw those lines, and that's what redistricting is all about in the United States.
And you suggest in the book that because of the dominance of left-oriented voters in urban areas in winner-take-all systems such as the United States, the left in the United States does not get the power it might otherwise get in a proportional representation system because it's sort of dissipated in this surplus of extra votes it doesn't get any extra credit for in these cities. Is that fair?
Yeah. So there is I think for a while now people have noticed that there are urban districts in the United States that are extremely democratic, and they end up. So if it's true that at the precinct level that you have a bunch of precincts clustered together that are 80% Democratic, it stands to reason that you draw a winner-take-all district around them, and you will have an 80% or a 75% Democratic district. So what we end up with in a lot of states, certainly not all states, but many of the more industrialized states, larger states, we end up with one or several districts, say like the Cook County, the Chicago districts, or in Missouri that we have St. Louis and Kansas City, or in Indianapolis, Indiana, it's Indianapolis and Gary, where there'll be a congressional district that is extremely Democratic, but then all the other Democrats who are spread out throughout the state in these smaller cities and in the rural areas, there are not enough of them to win districts in those places, and there are too many of them, so they win by large majorities in the cities. And so you end up with an asymmetry in the transformation of votes to seats.
And then you get this what economists call inframarginal and other types of words that describe the competition. So if you're in a very safe seat, you don't have to work very hard to please your constituents because you've got a big margin of error or corruption, depending on your preference of how you describe it.
Exactly.
So all the competition takes place at the primary level or at the jockeying for who the party nominee is going to get, who's going to get the blessing of the party's powerful. Because once you get that nomination, you're in. There's almost no chance that I live in Montgomery County, Maryland. It's very hard to get a Republican on the county council or a Republican in my congressional district. So you'd think that would change the incentives of the people in power to please their constituents.
Yes, in urban America, the only election is the primary. I mean, that's a pretty basic and interesting fact that I don't think we've fully understood. That the only thing you have to worry about is if you somehow screw up and attract a certain type of primary challenger. But the general election is a foregone conclusion.
Right.
And so, can you think about the various ways in which that might affect incentives of incumbents? And it's great. It's great for the incumbents. It's not good for the Democratic Party. In a state like Florida, you end up with the incumbents in the party are people from Miami-Dade who represent very left-wing constituencies. And then when the voters in the rest of Florida look at the Democratic Party in Florida and try to assess what they're all about, that's who they see, and that's that's the kind of conclusions they draw. They look at the type of representation they think they receive from those individuals, and it makes it hard for the Democrats to compete in state politics. So it's for a state where the Democrats do very well in Senate elections and gubernatorial elections, and the presidential elections, of course, are notoriously close. But in state kind of districted elections, the Republicans are dominant.
And we've been talking.
That's part of the explanation.
We've been talking about this, the implications at the national level. When you think about urban national politics and policy outcomes, when you think about it at the urban level, we have a lot of core cities in the United States that are not doing very well. So there are a few that are. New York being one of them. San Francisco has done pretty well. But I used to live in St. Louis. The urban core there is very dysfunctional. Kansas City is not very healthy. Detroit, an obvious failure. Cleveland, not so good. Part of my first thought as to why those cities have done so poorly and why their suburbs have done so well is because of this lack of competition for urban policies and urban choices. We have what you could call one-party rule in these cities, and it's not because they're Democrats. It's not that there's something bad about Democrats' policies per se. It's that anytime you have a monopoly, it's essentially what feels like a monopoly, even though there's an election every 4 years for the mayor. But if the party that the mayor represents wins every time, it can't be very good for serving the customer.
Yeah, I think that's right. It seems pretty obvious that competition is good, and there's lots of evidence to that effect that politicians who are forced to contend with very close and difficult re-election battles are much more in tune to the preferences of their constituents. They put forth more effort. They just try harder. It's a very intuitive thing to claim, and I think there's a lot of evidence to back that up. And so whether this how much of the kind of bad governance in urban America can we attribute to this? How much of urban decline can we what caused what? That's a harder question. I don't think I have I have all the answers to that. There's a pretty complex one.
Fair enough.
But I think that basic claim is a good one, and I think we see similar things are true in lots of places. It's better for the voter to have competition.
Now, we're recording this in September 2012. October 2012. So we're just about a month from a presidential election, and we have this weird thing in the United States called the Electoral College. We have this other weird thing, which is not that different from it, which is Wyoming gets 2 senators. Wyoming gets 1/50th of the Senate, even though they're nothing close to 1/50th of the population. So on the surface, it's an historical accident, right? When the Constitution was voted on and decided, there were all these political forces that urban and at the time agricultural versus cities in terms of jockeying for political power. And one of the ways that competition emerged was through this strange system we have where every state gets 2 senators, but being a representative is more proportional to population. Every state gets 1. You can't get a third of 1. So as a result, we have a policy that you could argue overrepresents that sparsely populated rural Republican-leaning Wyoming and doesn't fairly represent New York City or Los Angeles or Chicago at the national level. Is that an accurate description?
Yes, it is, and I think the aspect of that I've looked at most carefully is just looking at the flows of intergovernmental transfers and other resources from the federal government to the states, and there's a pretty striking correlation between the state's Senate representation per capita, or its legislative representation per capita, and the amount of federal funds it receives. So the states you mentioned, like Wyoming, are at the very top, and they receive just far more funds per capita than the large states. And then as for the implications for national policy and whether it pulls policies to the right, it certainly would seem to, it's not a stretch to imagine that if there's a kind of an urban-rural dimension to politics that's going to push things a bit in the rural direction. I mean, it's not quite as dramatic as we might think, because some of the overrepresented states are actually densely populated, like Rhode Island and Delaware, the initial states that actually created the rule in order to protect themselves.
Yeah.
But and eventually, it's kind of interesting, the story of how some of the sparsely populated Western states came to be states. There was once Dakota Territory, and it became North and South Dakota explicitly because it was useful at the time in bolstering a political majority to create 4 senators rather than 2.
Yeah.
And that certainly still continues. So one of the interesting things about this, though, is that within Senate delegations, so within a state like Ohio or Tennessee, or one of these ones that has a really asymmetric distribution of partisans within the state, sometimes you see that the Senate delegation is actually a little bit to the left of the House delegation, because the Senate is just a kind of winner-take-all for the whole state. And so if you think that, so these urban votes that don't matter so much in the House elections, they matter just as much in the Senate election as any other vote. So you sometimes see that kind of a left-leaning Democrat can actually win as a senator in one of these states. And so in some of those moments, you have a Senate delegation that is a bit to the left of the House delegation. But in general, it's correct that these Western sparsely populated states are overrepresented, and it kind of pulls the Senate as a whole to the right.
You'd think that would bother some folks, just the way the Electoral College does as well. I mean, a lot of people, I think, resent. Of course, it depends who you're rooting for, but who you're rooting for and how you feel about it may change on the nature of the Electoral College. But you always get these appeals that we need to abolish the Electoral College, that it's such a weird thing, and it should just be the popular vote that elects the president. We started off our conversation before we were recording. I think it was before we were recording. You emphasized your interest in positive outcomes. By positive, you meant merely not the everyday use of that word, but rather in social science, positive means the way things are, not whether they're good or bad. That's what we call normative outcomes. Normative outcomes are we judge whether the outcomes are good or bad. So right now we're describing positive effects, meaning these are the natural implications of these kind of systems of representation. But of course, many people have normative feelings about them. They think, well, if this pushes politics to the right, we ought to go to a better system. And those who are on the right would say, no, it's a great system. That's the way it should be.
Right.
What are your thoughts on something like the Electoral College? Is there anything normative to say about it? Or is it just it obviously encourages certain kinds of campaigning which affect how the national vote turns out? If it were a majority rule election, people would campaign very differently than they do now.
Yeah, my basic take on these things is I'm such a positivist about them. As a social scientist, I'm always trying to understand how these differences affect outcomes. And of course, every once in a while, you see something that really strikes you as just unfair. And I think Senate representation in the United States it has that quality. I think it's hard to come up with a really good normative justification for Wyoming having 2 senators and California having 2 senators. And the Electoral College as well seems to be something that is emerged from a set of negotiations that took place a long time ago, with issues in mind that are very different than the issues that people have today. So I can certainly see why people might. Why the Electoral College might emerge as something that people are offended by, but it seems that these things are so difficult to reform, mainly because someone always thinks they might benefit from the status quo, and it's
some
often but the interesting thing about it is that these things change over time, and I told a story earlier about how the Liberals in the UK should have latched on to proportional representation earlier, and they could have been much better off. And I think in the United States context, who latches on to what kind of electoral reform is always these things change over time depending on who thinks they might have an advantage. And the Electoral College, lots of analysis has been done on this. It is just like we were describing in the case of the House and the Senate. It is a majoritarian winner-take-all way of transforming preferences for a party into a legislative seat. In this case, it's just one seat; it's the executive. And so the question is: this thing biased systematically in favor of one party or the other? And the answer seems to be not really. And it kind of changes. There are scenarios if you go to the website 538.com. Nate Silver has some situations in which Romney can lose the Electoral College but win the popular vote, and also some scenarios in which the same can happen for Obama. The same is true when we go back historically. So it's not this urban geography that I'm describing. The states are large enough units that it doesn't really seem to affect the Electoral College. So it's not systematically biased every election in clearly in one direction, as far as I can tell. So at least that aspect of it is not as troubling as one might otherwise make it out to be.
And like many things that the founders did, which I think is a blessing, not a curse, they made it hard to change. It's not so much that I think it's not just that people are worried about whether they'd benefit in the future from the Electoral College. It's just that it's very costly to try to change it. And it gives you that inertia, which I think is often a good thing, not a bad thing. As I said, we're in October of 2012, and we're going to be hearing a lot about red states and blue states, red America, blue America. And you have a paper called Purple America. Is there anything in there you want to talk about that's different than what we've been talking about so far in terms of generalizing about the state of the electorate in the United States?
Well, I think, that we typically talk about, there's lots of work where we just talk at the individual level about voters, and there's lots of work, we really, because of the Electoral College and the Senate and the importance of the states, we talk a lot about states. And, what I've been doing in this project is trying to get lower than that, and not just to counties, but even down to precincts, and really try to really understand how people are arranged in space, and try to understand the polarization that we hear so much about at the elite level, to try to understand what it looks like at the individual level. And so, my colleague Mo Fiorina has done a lot to try to show that individuals are not really very polarized, that there's a lot of people kind of in the middle, and we this kind of bimodal distribution that we see in the legislature is not really what we see in society. So I've been kind of trying to understand how that works in metro areas, in cities, and where are the moderates. And as we discussed earlier, there are the suburbs are really where those are the purple places, and there's these things can be, the geography isn't always what it seems, but certainly the campaigns have a couple of different strategies that they can perhaps we're kind of accustomed to thinking about them as going after independents in places where there are lots of independents. So one way to try to win an election is to go to these purple suburbs and try to change the minds of independents. But of course, another way is to go to places where there are lots and lots of your supporters and try to make sure as many of them as possible show up to vote. At least in a swing state. At least in a swing state. Exactly.
In a safe state, you don't really care so much.
Right. So your strategies vary a lot depending on what kind of state it is. And so, using these kind of fine-grained precinct-level maps, you can kind of start to learn about what kinds of neighborhoods you expect the candidates. I mean, if you look at what the candidates are doing and what kind of ads they're purchasing, you can try to figure out what type of a strategy they are employing. And it does seem to be both parties seem to be working pretty hard to mobilize their base, but at the same time, you've got to try to it's a complicated set of trade-offs to decide how much to work on the base and how much to work on these suburban moderates.
I want to close with a conversation about the normative side, but maybe that's the wrong way to describe it. I think a lot of people have a romance about majority rule. Certainly, one way that small groups of people settle disputes is they say, well, let's take a vote. And whatever gets the most votes wins. And I think to a lot of people, that's obviously the fairest, best way to decide stuff. And so all of these things that we've been talking about that mitigate that, whether it's the Electoral College whether it's winner-take-all districts. A lot of people say, well, that's just not the right way to do things. Everything should be decided by a majority vote. And yet, as we know from work by Kenneth Arrow and others, majority vote in the normative sense, meaning leading to outcomes we'd like, isn't so strong as it seems. On the surface, nothing could be fairer than majority rule. And yet when you look a little closer, you start to see that majority rule's got some very deep flaws in it. And talk about that argument. Why is it that majority rule is not the best system, even though I think most people have that's their starting place, that's their default?
Yeah, this is one of the things that when I teach courses to undergraduates on institutions, we spend do this in the first or second week. It's a very easy things you can do to give the students, say, have them do a rank ordering of their preferences for what type of pizza they would like, and then you have each student rank 3, and you put them together, and it's very easy to find groups of students who have what in the social choice literature is called cycling majorities, where you can show that there is no such thing as the majority will. If I set up the institutions in such a way that there's first a round-robin tournament of pepperoni versus vegetarian, and then the winner of that is paired off against sausage, I can get a different outcome than if I do the initial pairings another way. And so I can show that whoever controls the agenda basically decides what kind of pizza the students are having. And it's kind of an example of something that we've known since Condorcet and Arrow and the classics of social choice theory, that it often is simply nonsensical to say that the majority has some kind of will that we will then translate into power, into policy. And so, the students are always sort of surprised by this. And we like to believe that there is such a thing as the group, the collective will. And I think one of the basic lessons of politics and of institutions is, unfortunately, it's possible to aggregate those preferences in very different ways with different institutions and get different outcomes. So we shouldn't attribute so much, importance to something that we believe was the outcome of some kind of majority choice. Often the truth is much more complicated, and agenda control and political power are often used in getting us to the outcomes we see. So it just leads us to kind of think in a little bit different way about how we interpret the decisions that are made by legislatures and what they actually mean.
Well, the other problem I have with will of the people is we have majority election, and let's say whether it's 55-45 or 90-10, the losers obviously felt differently. So it's not the will of the people; it's the will of those who won that election, whether it's a majority or whether it's proportional or whether there's this weird system we have in the United States. Right? We don't have referenda on every item. We have this weird thing called the legislature, called Congress and Senate, and there's committees. And we have all this baggage, all this incredible superstructured infrastructure around the way political outcomes are being coming out of our preferences. It's not just a majority rule referendum. And I think most people, there's a lot of problems with our political system, but most people just think, well, the best way would obviously be a referendum because that would reflect the will of the people. And it doesn't for all kinds of reasons, one of which is, as you said, the order of the voting can be manipulated, information can be manipulated. There's 1,000 things along the way, but the most important thing to me is that we all have different preferences. And so once you put it into a political process, you're basically saying we're going to get one outcome and you're stuck with it because it was the result of a vote. And I don't see that as necessarily fair at all.
Well, right. So one other way to think about democracy, instead of thinking that there's some will of majority and we're trying to use democratic institutions to aggregate that and then turn it into policy, a very different way of thinking about democracy is we're going to put some people in charge and they're going to do some stuff. And then after 4 years, we're going to look backwards retrospectively at what they've done and decide whether we like it or not. And if we like it, we'll give them another chance. And if we don't, we'll dip into the pool of candidates and we'll pull out another one and see if they can do better. And so this is a view of democracy that is really more about accountability than it is about a kind of representativeness of some underlying will. But as you already kind of described in the United States, it's becoming very difficult for us to do what I just described because we have a Senate, a House, lots of committees. We have the filibuster, we have the executive, we have the judiciary, and we have state governments, which then have two chambers and an executive. And it's very hard for us to figure out who's responsible for the policies we see and then somehow hold them accountable. And so that's why, to some people, to some minds, kind of a very clear British style accountability system would be better. Again, that's a normative question. There's trade-offs in both directions.
Yeah, well, I'll make a normative comment. My preference is because political decisions will struggle to reflect anything remotely like the will of the people, I want as few decisions as possible put into that sandbox, and I rather have the competition of free association and free choice make those decisions and allow for the diversity of outcomes that private markets and private decisions have, rather than political decisions, which are inevitably coercive. But that's my normative preference.
Yep, I mean it's kind of a new, thinking about how institutions reflect the will of individuals. I mean these are basic questions that people don't often think about, but they really should shape the way you answer these bigger normative questions about, say, how large should the state be?
Yeah,
what kinds of things should the state do?
Yeah, exactly. Well, we're almost out of time. Do you want to say anything about this upcoming election as a positive political scientist? Either at the national level or the House, at the presidential or the House or the Senate?
Well, it seems likely that we will have more of the same in that we'll have divided government of some kind. That seems the most likely outcome. So, if we are hoping for a big resolution to all the uncertainty that we think characterizes the current moment, I suspect there won't be much uncertainty resolution. But that said, it is something that will be exciting and interesting to watch, and there's a lot that still has to happen. It's certainly not a done deal in either direction.
My guest today has been Jonathan Rodden. Jonathan, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thanks very much. I enjoyed it.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.